The lobby of Meridian Tower went quiet the moment he walked in, not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention. It was the opposite, really. A man in a faded canvas jacket, carrying a scratched thermos and wearing boots that had seen too many winters, stepping through a set of glass doors that cost more than most people's cars. The kind of quiet that follows something that doesn't fit. The kind people feel before they decide what to do about it. His name was Walter Ames. He was 58 years old, and he walked the way men walk when they have stopped caring what people think of them. Not arrogantly, not carelessly, but with a kind of settled patience that can look, to the wrong eyes. It's like someone who has simply given up. He hadn't given up, but no one in that lobby knew that yet. The woman behind the front desk, young and precise in a charcoal blazer, looked up from her screen. Her name was Noelle, and she had been working at Meridian's headquarters for 3 years. She had learned quickly how to read a room, and more importantly, how to read a person the moment they cleared the threshold. She read Walter Ames in approximately 4 seconds. She offered him the smile she reserved for delivery drivers and contractors who had wandered in through the wrong entrance. "Can I help you?" she said. The words were polite. The tone was a door, slightly ajar with a foot already pressing against it from the other side. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, Walter said. She glanced at her screen. "The stakeholder briefing? That's the one." Another look, this one longer. "And your name?" "Ames. Walter Ames." She typed it slowly, the way people type when they expect the system to confirm what they already believe. Then she stopped, looked at the screen, looked at him, looked at the screen again. Let me just verify with the team," she said, her tone shifting into something more careful. "If you'd like to take a seat." Walter nodded and sat down on one of the low leather benches near the window. He set his thermos on his knee. Outside, the morning light was cutting across the city in long, pale strips, and he watched it for a while, the way a man watches something he has seen many times and still finds worth looking at. He did not take out his phone. He did not fidget. He just waited, the way he always had. Across the lobby, 2 men in suits noticed him. One leaned toward the other and said something low. The other glanced over and then looked away with the particular quickness of someone who does not want to be caught looking. They had the easy confidence of people who belong in rooms like this and know it, and the sight of a man who clearly did not, or so they thought, registered somewhere between amusement and mild irritation. The elevator doors opened and a woman walked out. Her name was Cassandra Vale, and she was the kind of person who made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She was 44, VP of Corporate Development, and she had spent the last 6 years making Meridian consolidated into something that appeared, on the surface, to be entirely her creation. She wore her success like a second skin, fitted and expensive, and she moved through the lobby with the brisk economy of someone whose time was currency and who was already spending it. She stopped when she saw Noelle's expression. "What is it?" Cassandra said. Noelle leaned in and said something quiet. Cassandra's eyes moved to the man on the bench. She took him in, the jacket, the boots, the scratched thermos, the way he was simply sitting there watching the light on the street outside, entirely unbothered. She crossed the lobby toward him. "Excuse me," she said. Walter looked up. "Are you Walter Ames?" "I am. The briefing today is a closed executive session," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but her meaning was not. "I'm not sure who gave you this information, but there may have been a mix-up. This event is for registered stakeholders and board-level guests." Walter looked at her for a moment. He had a way of looking at people that was neither aggressive nor soft, just steady. The way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before he says anything about it. "I'm aware of that," he said. "Then you understand why I have to ask. I'm on the list, Miss Vale." A small pause. She hadn't introduced herself. "The briefing begins in 20 minutes, she continued, recovering smoothly. "If there's been a registration error, we can certainly look into it after the event, but I can't allow access to the floor without confirmed credentials." "That's reasonable," Walter said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a single folded card. He held it out to her. She took it the way people take things they expect to prove a point, and then she read it, and the point shifted entirely. She read it again. "I'll arrange for someone to escort you up," she said, her voice now occupying a different register entirely. Still controlled, but something beneath it had changed, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. She handed the card back. Walter folded it and put it back in his pocket. "I know the way," he said, and stood. The 23rd floor of Meridian Tower was the kind of space that had been designed to say something about the people who worked in it. The conference room was all glass and pale wood, with a view of the harbor that stretched out to the east like something that had been put there specifically to impress. A long table, leather chairs, water in crystal pitchers, not plastic bottles. The 12 people already in the room had the look of people who were used to spaces like this. They sat the way powerful people sit, with a kind of gravitational ease, occupying their chairs fully, taking up the oxygen in a room without needing to announce that they were doing it. Walter Ames walked in and found a seat near the end of the table. For a moment, nobody said anything directly to him, but several people exchanged looks. A man named Trent, the kind of 40-year-old who had never experienced a consequence he couldn't negotiate his way out of, leaned toward the woman beside him and said something behind his hand. The woman, her name was Lori, and she was sharper than Trent, which was not something Trent knew, didn't respond. She was watching Walter with a different kind of attention. The briefing began. Slides went up. Figures were discussed, acquisition targets, margin projections, the kind of language that turns human decisions into numbers and then presents the numbers as if they were inevitable. Walter listened. He did not take notes. He asked no questions. This is sometimes what happens when a person has already formed their conclusions and is simply waiting to see whether the presentation will confirm them. At the break, the room loosened. People stood, refilled their glasses, formed the small clusters that form when people want to be seen talking to the right people. Cassandra moved through the room with practiced ease. She had composed herself completely since the lobby. She was good at that. She stopped near Walter, and this time the warmth in her voice had been recalibrated into something that could pass at a distance for graciousness. "I hope the session has been useful," she said. "It has," Walter said. "We're always glad to have stakeholder perspectives at these events." She said it the way people say things when they are trying to absorb a situation that has surprised them, and to absorb it quietly. "I'm sure," said Walter. A pause. She was about to say something more, some practiced line that would let her learn what she wanted to learn about him without appearing to ask, when the door opened. The room changed. It changed the way rooms change when someone certain walks into them, not loudly but completely. The clusters loosened. People turned. Conversations let go of their threads. Governor Ellison Cross walked in. He was a tall man, 61, with the unhurried ease of someone who had spent long enough in public life to stop performing for it. He wore a dark suit and a blue tie, and he moved through the door without the production that sometimes surrounds men of his position. And the first thing he did, the very first thing, before he acknowledged the room, before he spoke to the aide at his shoulder, before he did anything else, was look toward the end of the table. He saw Walter, and he smiled. Not the public smile, wide and shaped for cameras. Something older than that. The smile of a man who sees someone he did not expect to see and finds that the surprise is a good one. He crossed the room. The cluster of people between him and the end of the table parted in the unhurried, inevitable way that clusters part around a man like Ellison Cross, and he walked through them without noticing he was doing it, his eyes on Walter, who had stood. They shook hands, and then the governor pulled him in briefly by the shoulder, the way men do when a handshake isn't quite enough. "Walt," he said, "I didn't know you'd be here." "The board thought it would be useful," Walter said. The board was right. Ellison Cross turned to the room, which was, by this point, very still. "You all know Walter Ames?" Several people looked at one another. Cassandra Vale had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from composing your face so carefully that the effort becomes visible. "Walter built the infrastructure division," the governor said, "before it was worth building, before anyone thought it was worth building. He sold it to Meridian 8 years ago, and the terms of the agreement, I read this somewhere and I've never forgotten it. The terms were almost offensive to his own interests. I asked him about it once." He looked at Walter. "What did you tell me?" Walter considered. "I said I wanted it to stay intact." He said he wanted it to stay intact, the governor repeated. He was not performing this for the room's benefit. He was simply saying what was true in the way that men who have lived long enough sometimes do. He didn't want the thing he'd spent 20 years building to be taken apart for parts. So he took less money than he was owed, and he made them promise to keep the team together. He paused. "I've worked with a lot of people in this city. I don't know many who would do that." The room was quiet in a way that was different from any previous quiet in it that morning. This was not the quiet of uncertainty or politeness. It was the quiet of people recalibrating quickly and privately everything they had decided without deciding it. Cassandra Vale, who had spent 6 years building something on a foundation she had not examined closely enough, stood very still near the window. The lunch that followed was the kind that rearranges itself around the presence of a person without meaning to. People who had not spoken to Walter that morning found reasons to speak to him now. The conversation nearest him grew larger. Someone laughed at something he said, and Walter, who said it with the flat plainness of a man who is not trying to be funny, looked faintly surprised by the response. Trent introduced himself twice, apparently forgetting that he had already done so, or perhaps hoping the second introduction would somehow replace the first, which had not gone the way he'd intended. Laurie, who had been watching quietly all morning, sat beside Walter at lunch and asked him a direct question about the infrastructure project, and he answered it in the same way he answered everything, without excess, without performance, with the slight forward lean of someone who is actually thinking about what they are saying, rather than thinking about how it will land. She appreciated that. Cassandra Vale ate very little. At some point during the meal, Governor Cross leaned over from 2 seats away and said something to Walter that no one else could hear, and Walter nodded and said something back, and the governor laughed, a real one, short and unguarded. People noticed. People always notice the things that happen in the margins of rooms, the details that don't make it into the formal record. They noticed the thermos Walter had set on the credenza when he came in. They noticed that he had not ordered anything from the catered menu, and instead ate what appeared to be a sandwich he had brought in a paper bag, without any self-consciousness about this. They noticed that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he spoke, the room shifted slightly to accommodate it. They noticed mostly that he was entirely unbothered by any of it. This is what unsettles people who organize their sense of power around visibility. The person who does not need to be seen, who was in the room before you arrived and will still be in the room when you leave, settled as sewn furniture that was built for the space rather than carried in and arranged. Cassandra found him near the elevator bank at the end of the afternoon, when most of the room had already dispersed. She had been moving toward this moment all day, she realized, composing it, discarding it, composing it again. She stopped beside him. "Mr. Ames," she said. He turned. She had rehearsed several versions of what she intended to say. They all began with a kind of careful acknowledgement, a professional pivot, the way you turn a conversation around without admitting that you had been going the wrong direction. But standing there in the quieted hallway with the afternoon light going flat across the harbor below, she found that what came out was simpler than what she had prepared. "I owe you an apology," she said, "from this morning." Walter looked at her, the same steady, ungrudging attention he gave everything. "You were doing your job," he said. "I was making assumptions," she said. "That's different." He was quiet for a moment. "It is," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. But it wasn't the absence of it either. It was something more honest than either. The acknowledgement that something had happened between 2 adults without the softening fiction that it hadn't." The elevator arrived. Walter picked up his thermos from the small table by the wall. "Thank you for the briefing," he said. "Good work being done here. The margins on the eastern expansion are stronger than they look." She blinked. "You think so?" The Q3 presentation buried the lead, worth revisiting before the board meeting. He said it the way he said most things, as a simple observation, offered and then let go. He stepped into the elevator. The doors began to close. "Mr. Ames," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you take the lower terms?" she said. 8 years ago, when you sold. Why not just take what you were owed?" Walter thought about this for a moment, the way he seemed to think about most things, not slowly but fully. "The people on that team," he said, "had given me 15 years. Some of them had turned down better offers to stay." He shifted the thermos to his other hand. "Money comes back. You can rebuild it. But you don't get to go back and tell someone that what they gave you mattered after you've already shown them that it didn't." The doors closed. Cassandra Vale stood in the hallway for a moment, alone, looking at where he had been. 3 weeks later, the Meridian board received a letter. It was 3 paragraphs, typed, no letterhead. The tone was direct, not unkind, but not softened either. It outlined what Walter Ames had observed at the briefing, the Q3 margin issue, and 2 structural concerns about the eastern expansion that the internal team had not flagged. The analysis was precise and, as the CFO later put it, the kind of thing that would have taken their own team 6 weeks to put together. The letter was signed with his full name and a phone number, nothing else. At the bottom in the narrow margin, someone had added a handwritten line. Not Walter, but Governor Cross, who had apparently seen the letter before it was sent. It said, simply, "He does this." Walter Ames drove home that evening in a truck that was 11 years old and had a crack in the dashboard that he kept meaning to have looked at. He stopped at the same diner he stopped at most evenings, a place on the county road with good coffee and a counter where they knew his order. He sat by the window and watched the highway and ate his dinner without looking at his phone. He thought about the morning, about the lobby and the woman at the desk with her careful smile, and Cassandra Vale and her adjusted voice, and the thing that had shifted in her face when she read the card. He thought about the room full of people who had looked at his jacket and made a decision that felt, to them, like simple observation. He did not feel bitter about it. He had felt that once, long ago, in the early years when the company was small and the meetings were in borrowed conference rooms, and no one held the door for him. He'd learned something in those years that had taken him a while to put into words. The thing about respect, he'd finally decided, was that it was either present in a person before they had a reason to give it, or it wasn't. Everything else, the recognition, the deference, the room arranging itself, that was just information about who people were. He had stopped needing it to tell him who he was. He left a good tip the way he always did. Not a performative one, but the kind that comes from having been the person who needed it. He nodded to the woman behind the counter, whose name was Deborah, and who had been working that counter for 11 years, and had never once asked him what he did for a living, which he appreciated. He got back in the truck. On the seat beside him, unopened, was a small envelope. It had arrived that morning, before he'd left for the city, and he hadn't had time to read it. He opened it now, in the diner parking lot with the engine idling. It was from his daughter. A photograph, her 2 kids in the backyard, the older one carrying the younger one on her back, both of them mid-law, the yard in the particular gold that comes in the late hour of a summer afternoon. On the back she'd written, "They asked about Grandpa Walt again. When are you coming?" Walter Ames sat in his 11-year-old truck in a diner parking lot at the edge of the county road and looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put it in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket, closest to where it needed to be, and he drove home through the last of the evening light.